They thought they knew how this would go. That is the thing that makes what happened so specifically, so personally, so deeply unsettling for them. Not just that you went quiet, but that in going quiet you violated a prediction they were not even fully aware they had made about you. About how you would respond. About what your love meant and what it was capable of, and what its absolute outer limit looked like when it was finally honestly tested. They had a model, built from the full history of the dynamic between you, from every reaching you did after every withdrawal they produced, from every time you softened a boundary or reopened a conversation, or returned to something that had not been adequately resolved, because the alternative of not returning felt worse than the cost of returning on insufficient terms. The model said you would always come back, not as an explicit belief. Not something they sat with consciously and considered and decided was true. As the operational background assumption of someone who has been given enough consistent evidence of a pattern to stop questioning whether the pattern will hold, you had given them that evidence, repeatedly, generously, with the specific, reliable consistency of someone whose love was larger than their self-protection for a very long time. And then your silence arrived, and the model was wrong. And the wrongness of the model did not produce in the avoidant the clean, philosophical experience of an assumption being revised. It produced something far more personal, far more uncomfortable, far more difficult to manage back to the composed, self-sufficient, apparently unaffected surface that the avoidant has spent their entire adult life maintaining in the face of relational difficulty. It produced embarrassment, it produced fury. And understanding why, understanding the specific, psychologically precise reasons why your silence produced those two specific responses in that specific sequence is one of the most illuminating and practically important things available to you right now. There are things that need to be said at the outset of this conversation that will anchor everything that follows in honesty rather than in the comfortable but incomplete version of this dynamic that flatters one side at the expense of accuracy. The embarrassment and the fury that your silence produced in the avoidant are real. They are not performances. They are not the strategic deployment of emotional expression designed to pull you back into the dynamic. They are the genuine, uncomfortable, poorly managed internal experience of someone whose psychological equilibrium has been disrupted in a way they were not prepared for and do not have adequate tools to process. This reality deserves acknowledgement, not because it makes their behavior acceptable. It does not, and the behavior that produced your silence remains what it was regardless of the emotional experience the silence subsequently creates in them. But because understanding the genuine quality of their experience is part of seeing the situation clearly, and seeing the situation clearly is the only position from which good decisions about what comes next become available. The embarrassment and the fury are also not your responsibility to soothe. They are not a signal that your silence was wrong, or that the self-protection it represented was unkind, or that the model whose wrongness it revealed was your obligation to correct by returning to the pattern that confirmed it. They are the natural, predictable, psychologically consistent consequence of a person encountering the limits of an assumption they were never entitled to hold in the first place. Both things are true simultaneously. The emotions are real, and they are not your responsibility. The experience is genuine, and it does not obligate you. The discomfort is significant, and it is not evidence that you did something wrong. Hold all of this before continuing. The embarrassment comes first, before the fury, before any of the behavioral responses that the fury produces, before the narrative reconstruction that the combination of the two eventually generates. The embarrassment arrives, and it arrives in a specific and specific way that requires careful examination, because it is the most revealing of the two emotions about what your silence actually did to the avoidance interior world. The embarrassment is not the ordinary social variety. Not the embarrassment of having said something awkward or having been caught in a minor inconsistency or having been seen in a moment of imperfection by someone whose opinion matters. Those varieties of embarrassment are uncomfortable but manageable. They resolve through the ordinary mechanisms of self-forgiveness and the passage of time and the availability of other interactions that provide counter-evidence to the embarrassing moment. The embarrassment that your silence produces is structural. It reaches into the architecture of the avoidance self-concept and exposes a gap that was always there but that the dynamic, in its previous configuration, with your consistent reaching and your reliable availability and your love that absorbed the pattern without requiring its fundamental change, had always successfully papered over. The gap between who the avoidant presents as being and who the avoidance behavior demonstrates them to be. The avoidance self-concept, the internal narrative they carry about the kind of person they are, almost certainly includes a version of themselves that is at some level a person of integrity, a person who, whatever their relational difficulties, is fundamentally decent, who treats people with a baseline of respect and care that might not always be perfectly executed but is genuinely intended, who does not, at the core of their character, take people for granted or treat love as infrastructure, or make the specific, recurring mistake of allowing someone's consistent caring to become so normalized that it stops registering as something requiring reciprocation or gratitude or even acknowledgement. And then your silence arrives, and what it shows in the specific mirror that your withdrawal holds up to the avoidance behavior is exactly that, the taking for granted, the treating of love as infrastructure. The allowing of your consistency to become so normalized that its sudden absence, rather than being processed as the consequence of their behavior, is processed as a violation, as something done to them, as a betrayal of an expectation that was, on any honest examination, an expectation they had no right to hold. The mirror is brutal, not because you held it up cruelly, because the clarity of what it reflects is undeniable. The avoidant looks at their own behavior, at the withdrawals and the emotional unavailability and the pattern of receiving generosity without adequately returning it, through the specific lens of your silence making that behavior visible in its full uncontextualized form. And what they see does not match the self-narrative, does not match the version of themselves as a person of fundamental decency, does not match the story they have been telling about the dynamic and their role in it, and whether the dynamic was something they were navigating with sufficient care. The gap between the self-narrative and the reflection is the embarrassment, and it is large, and it is specific. And it is not something that can be resolved by the ordinary mechanisms of self-forgiveness, because it is not a single incident of imperfection that can be apologized for and moved past. It is the accumulated evidence of a pattern. And patterns are not resolved by apologies, they are resolved by change. And the embarrassment that your silence produced is, in part, the avoidance private, unacknowledged awareness that change is what is required, and that change is the thing they have been most consistently declining to produce. The fury arrives on the heels of the embarrassment, and its arrival is not coincidental. Understanding the relationship between the two, the specific psychological sequence that leads from embarrassment to fury in the avoidance interior experience, is essential for understanding both what your silence did and what the fury actually means beneath its surface presentation. The fury is the embarrassment in motion. It is the embarrassment finding an outlet that does not require the avoidant to stay in the exposed, uncomfortable, self-confronting experience of being seen in the mirror that your silence holds up. Because staying in that experience, staying with the full, honest, unmanaged weight of seeing the gap between the self-narrative and the reflection, requires exactly the kind of vulnerability and self-accountability that the avoidance entire psychology was constructed to avoid. So, the embarrassment moves, it transforms, it finds the direction that is least expensive for someone whose psychological economy has always run on the currency of distance and self-protection. It becomes external rather than internal. It becomes about what you did rather than about what they did. It becomes fury. This is not a calculated process. The avoidant does not sit with the embarrassment, recognize it as too uncomfortable, and consciously decide to convert it into fury as a management strategy. The conversion is automatic. It is the psychological immune system operating at the speed of reflex rather than the speed of deliberation. The uncomfortable internal experience of self-confrontation encounters the defensive architecture, and the defensive architecture, doing what it was built to do, routes the discomfort away from the self and toward the external source of the disruption. You are the external source of the disruption. You and your silence. You and your refusal to fill the role that the model required. You and your apparently simple, apparently uncomplicated, apparently casual withdrawal of the availability that the avoidance equilibrium was quietly depending on. So the fury arrives at you, not because you did something wrong, because you are the most available target for a feeling that needed to go somewhere other than inward, and you happen to be the person whose behavior disrupted the comfortable configuration. The fury is, at its root, embarrassment looking for an address that is not the avoidant's own face in the mirror. What does the fury actually look like? Because it is important to recognize it accurately, in whatever form it reaches you, directly or indirectly, Rather than taking it at face value and allowing its surface presentation to tell the story the avoidance defensive architecture wants it to tell, the fury tends to arrive in several recognizable forms, none of which announce themselves as what they actually are. The first form is the narrative reconstruction. The sudden emergence, in the aftermath of your silence, of a revised version of the relationship's history in which your behavior, your emotional expression, your needs, your patterns, becomes the primary subject of critique. The moments when you were too much. The times your emotion was expressed with an intensity that can be labeled excessive. The instances where your need was visible in ways that can be characterized as pressure or demand, or the specific emotional weight that made the dynamic difficult to navigate. These moments are real. You were imperfect in the dynamic. Everyone is imperfect in every dynamic. But the selection and amplification of your imperfections as the primary lens through which the relationship's difficulties are examined, the construction of a narrative in which your behavior is the central problem rather than a peripheral complication, is the fury doing its work. Making the story about you rather than about them. Making the mirror face outward rather than inward. The second form is the indifference performance, the deliberate, slightly over-constructed presentation of being entirely unaffected by your silence. Of having moved smoothly and easily into a life that does not notice the absence of you in it. Of being fine in the specific, pronounced, slightly too emphatic way of someone who is performing fineness for an audience they are not willing to acknowledge they are performing for. The indifference performance is the fury's quieter form. It does not express the anger directly, but carries it in the specific quality of a presentation that is organized around the message that your silence has produced no meaningful impact, which is the thing the fury most needs to communicate as a counter to the embarrassing truth that your silence has produced significant impact. The third form is the most direct and the most revealing, and it is the one that tends to arrive when the previous forms have been insufficient to adequately manage the embarrassment. It is the contact that carries anger in its quality without being explicitly about anger, the reaching out that is wrapped in critique or coldness, or the specific slightly hostile energy of someone who is making contact primarily to communicate that the contact is on their terms, rather than in response to any need they might be feeling. The message that says, through its tone if not its content, I am not bothered by your silence, I am simply choosing to engage with you now, from a position of complete composure and complete adequacy. And your silence was not something that required a response, because it was not something that particularly affected me. The message is the lie. The reaching out is the truth. The avoidant who is genuinely unaffected does not make contact. The avoidant who is managing the embarrassment and the fury and the disrupted model through the performance of indifference does not at some point reach out with the specific quality of someone who needs to demonstrate something. The reaching is always about the reaching, whatever it is wrapped in. There is a specific aspect of the embarrassment that deserves its own examination, because it is the one that produces the most lasting and the most significant disruption to the avoidant's interior world. Not the embarrassment of being seen in the mirror generally. The specific, targeted embarrassment of having waited for something that never came. The avoidant waited for you to beg, not with conscious awareness of the waiting, with the background, operational, automatic expectation of the script's next beat. And the beat did not come. And the not coming of it was visible, not dramatically, not in a way that could be observed from the outside as the obvious evidence of waiting and not being met, but internally in the specific and private experience of an expectation that was not fulfilled, of a stimulus that was predicted and did not arrive. The embarrassment of having waited and not been met has a particular quality that is distinct from the general embarrassment of the mirror. It has the specific, personal, slightly humiliating quality of having been caught in a posture of expecting, of having been, in the private interior of the waiting, the one who needed the next beat of the script more than the other person did, the one whose equilibrium was quietly dependent on the other person's behavior, the one who was, underneath all the self-sufficient composure and all the managed distance, and all the apparent comfort with the space between you, waiting, the avoidant was waiting for you to reach, for you to break the silence, for the familiar pattern of your consistency to reassert itself and restore the comfortable configuration. And the waiting, private, unacknowledged, managed into invisibility, is the evidence of a need that the avoidant self-narrative has always denied, the need for the connection. The dependence on your availability, the specific and real way in which your consistent presence has been functioning as a form of emotional regulation for someone who has been insisting, to themselves and to everyone around them, that they are perfectly capable of regulating without it. Your silence exposed the waiting, and the exposure of the waiting is the most embarrassing thing of all, because it reveals the need, and the need, revealed in the specific and undeniable form of having waited and not been met, cannot be framed as anything other than what it is. A person who said they did not need and found, in the absence of what they said they did not need, that they did. The fury at this specific embarrassment, the fury at having been caught waiting, at having the need exposed, at having the self-sufficient narrative revealed as less complete than it appeared, is perhaps the most specifically directed of all the avoidance responses to your silence. It is the fury of someone who has been seen in a moment of genuine vulnerability and has not had the emotional capacity to stay in the vulnerability, and is therefore routing it outward with as much force and speed as the defensive architecture can generate. This fury will feel, if it reaches you in any of its forms, like something about you, like evidence that you did something wrong, like an argument for why your silence was unkind or manipulative or unfair. The avoidance fury is very good at presenting itself as a legitimate grievance rather than as a defensive response to embarrassing self-revelation. It has the quality of moral weight, of someone who has been genuinely wronged rather than someone who is managing the discomfort of having been seen. Do not let it rewrite the story. The story is not what the fury is presenting. The story is that you removed your availability from a dynamic that was depending on it in ways that were never adequately reciprocated. The story is that the model broke because the model was wrong. The story is that your silence was the honest expression of someone who finally, genuinely stopped absorbing more than was being returned. That is the story. The fury is the management of the embarrassment that the story produces in the person whose behavior is the reason the story went the way it went. What happens after the embarrassment and the fury have run their initial course? After the first acute phase of the disruption, the narrative reconstruction, the indifference performance, the contact with its hostile undertone, has settled into the less acute but more persistent phase of the avoidance ongoing encounter with the reality your silence revealed. The less acute phase is in some ways more significant than the initial acute phase, because the acute phase was driven by urgency, and urgency produces its own energy and its own capacity for the management strategies to operate. The less acute phase is driven by nothing except the persistent, low-level, difficult-to-manage awareness of something that has not been resolved. The something that has not been resolved is not your silence. Your silence is resolved. It is simply present, a fact of the current configuration, not a crisis requiring immediate management. The something that has not been resolved is what your silence revealed, the model's wrongness, the need's exposure, the gap between the self-narrative and the reflection, the specific, personal, still-present knowledge that someone who loved them generously reached the honest limit of what they could continue absorbing and expressed that limit not with drama or declaration, but with the quiet, complete, unperformable withdrawal of their consistent presence. That knowledge does not resolve through the management strategies. It does not quiet with time in the way that the acute phase's urgency quiets. It becomes instead the persistent background awareness that the avoidance daily life is now operating against. The reference point that is always there, always available, against which every relational interaction is now measured. Against which the performances of indifference and the narrative reconstructions are always at some level known to be performances and reconstructions. The persistent knowledge produces a specific kind of restlessness, not the dramatic restlessness of someone in a crisis. The quiet, difficult-to-name restlessness of someone who knows they are not where they are supposed to be and does not know how to get to where they are supposed to be, and is therefore in the uncomfortable suspension of between. Between the old configuration that the model described and that your silence revealed as unavailable, and the genuine change that the revelation is pointing toward, but that the avoidant does not yet have the tools or the willingness to fully pursue. This between is where the most important things happen, or fail to happen, where the fall either continues its work or gets managed back to a level that no longer requires a response, where the invitation that the embarrassment and the fury and the exposed waiting together constitute is either accepted or declined. The acceptance looks like turning the fury inward, not in the punishing, self-blaming way that produces collapse rather than change. In the honest, clear-eyed, finally accountable way of someone who allows the embarrassment to be what it is, information, painful and specific and pointing somewhere, rather than what the fury wanted to make it, which is someone else's fault. which is a problem with you and your silence, rather than a revelation about them and their pattern. The acceptance looks like sitting with the exposure of the need, with the specific humiliation, and it does feel like humiliation for someone whose self-sufficient narrative has been central to their sense of who they are, of having been caught waiting, of having found, in the absence of what they said they did not need, that the not needing was a performance rather than a reality, of having the dependence revealed in the most undeniable way available, not through declaration, but through the body's own evidence of having oriented toward the expected stimulus and found it absent. Sitting with that, not managing it, not converting it, not routing it back outward into fury or forward into the performance of indifference, is the beginning of the genuine work, not the end. The beginning, the first step of something that has many more steps, and most of them are difficult, and none of them are glamorous, and all of them require the sustained daily instance-level choosing of the open position over the defended one. But the beginning, and the beginning matters, because without the acceptance of the embarrassment, without the willingness to let it be information about themselves rather than indictment of you, the beginning is not available. The decline looks like something that the avoidant is very practiced at producing. It looks like the gradual normalization of the disruption, the slow, consistent, effective routing of the acute embarrassment, and the initial fury through the available management strategies until the emotional temperature has reduced to a level that no longer requires immediate response. The narrative reconstruction becoming sufficiently stable to operate as a replacement for the honest accounting. The indifference performance becoming sufficiently practiced to feel less like performance and more like genuine state. The model being revised just enough. The assumption of your absolute availability updated to the assumption of your likely eventual availability to restore the functional equilibrium without the fundamental architectural change that genuine revision would require. The decline does not look dramatic. It looks like life continuing, like the avoidant moving through their days with the characteristic competence and self-sufficiency that their patterns provide, like the disruption your silence caused being metabolized into the background of things that happened rather than remaining in the foreground of things that require response. And from the outside, from your position, in your silence, without access to the interior of what is happening on their side, the decline and the acceptance can look identical for a period of time. Both look like the absence of dramatic response. Both look like the continuation of the silence from their side. The difference between them is internal and invisible, and only becomes visible over time, in the behavioral evidence of whether something is actually shifting or whether the equilibrium has simply been restored at the cost of the opportunity the disruption was offering. You cannot determine which is happening. And trying to determine it, orienting your attention toward the question of whether the avoidant is genuinely reckoning or skillfully managing, is the most available form of returning to the monitoring that your silence was built to exit. It is the question that, in being asked, re-centers them in your attention, reinstalls the dynamic as the primary variable of your emotional life, recreates the configuration that the silence was dissolving. The question of whether they are embarrassed and furious, and reckoning honestly or embarrassed and furious, and managing skillfully is their question. It belongs to their interior, it lives in their private, defended, only accessible to them experience of the disruption your silence produced. And your engagement with it, your monitoring of its answer, your adjustment of your behavior in response to its latest evidence, is not available to you without the cost of the very self-possession that produced the silence in the first place. What is available to you, entirely and without the cost of anything you built, is the continuation of the life that the silence was always pointing toward. The life that is yours and is moving and does not require the avoidance reckoning to be complete. The life in which the embarrassment and the fury and the disrupted model and all of it, real and significant as it is simply what is happening on their side of a silence that you produced from the most honest and most self-respecting place available to you. Their side is theirs. Your side is yours. And your side, the life you are living, the ground you are standing on, the version of yourself that the silence revealed and is continuing to develop, is the only side from which every good decision, every genuine healing, every real forward movement is available. The embarrassment and the fury are, in the honest accounting, the beginning of something that your silence made possible for the first time in the dynamic. The beginning of the avoidant's honest encounter with the cost of their own patterns, with the need they denied, with the waiting they performed, with the gap between the self-narrative and the reflection that your consistent, generous, finally concluded presence held up for long enough to become undeniable. You did not hold the mirror up to hurt them. You held it up by simply stopping, by finally, genuinely, without performance or strategy or the calculation of effect, withdrawing the energy that had been confirming the model. And the mirror that your withdrawal produced is not your creation. It is the simple, honest reflection of a dynamic that had been running at your expense for long enough that the running of it finally exhausted itself. The reflection is theirs to look at, the embarrassment is theirs to sit with, the fury is theirs to trace back to its source. The reckoning that all of it is pointing toward is entirely, completely, solely their work to do. And you, standing in your silence, living your life, building the ground that the dynamic was always preventing you from building fully, you are neither responsible for whether they do the work, nor required to be present for it. You are simply present for your own, which is the only work you were ever actually given to do. The work of being completely, unapologetically, genuinely yourself, without the model, without the role, without the consistent, reliable, finally concluded availability that the dynamic was quietly running on, without the begging they expected and never received, without the return they assumed and watched not come. With only this, the quiet, complete, entirely sufficient reality of someone who finally chose themselves and found, in the choosing, that themselves was more than enough. Always was. Always was. And the knowing of it arrived not as a gift handed over cleanly, but as something excavated, slowly, through the specific, unglamorous daily work of continuing to choose the silence, when everything in the dynamic's gravity was pulling toward the familiar sound of reaching. Through the mornings when the restraint was genuine, and the mornings when it required the kind of effort that does not feel heroic, because it is entirely private, and entirely unwitnessed, and entirely without the validation that effort usually seeks. Through the weeks in which the avoidance, embarrassment, and fury were running their course on their side of the silence, while you were running your own very different course on yours. Your course did not look like theirs. Your course did not have the hot, pressurized quality of embarrassment converting into fury, converting into narrative reconstruction, converting into the performance of indifference. Your course had a different texture entirely. Quieter, more inward, more concerned with the question of what you are building than with the question of what they are experiencing. Not because their experience is irrelevant, it is not, and understanding it has been the work of this entire conversation, but because their experience, however real and however significant, is not the primary terrain of your healing. Your terrain is your own interior, the specific, daily, gradually shifting landscape of a person who is reclaiming the space that the dynamic occupied. Who is finding, in the quiet that the silence created, the version of themselves that was always present, but was consistently crowded out by the monitoring and the managing and the absorbing that the dynamic required? Who is discovering, not in a single dramatic moment of revelation, but in the slow accumulating evidence of days that belonged to them, that the self they were protecting by staying in the role was not as protected as it appeared? That the version of themselves most visible in the dynamic was a version shaped significantly by the dynamic's requirements, softer in some places than their actual nature, more accommodating in some ways than genuine accommodation warrants, more organized around another person's comfort than around their own honest experience. The reclamation of the actual self, the one that existed before the dynamic's gravity exerted its shaping influence, is not a dramatic event. It is the gradual reemergence of preferences that were set aside, of opinions that were softened, of needs that were qualified into something more manageable before being expressed, or never expressed at all because the expressing of them created a friction that the dynamic did not have room for. Of the specific, personal, entirely legitimate ways of moving through the world that were being quietly adjusted to fit the avoidance tolerance, rather than being honored as simply what they are, this reemergence is sometimes disorienting. Because the person who comes back as the dynamic's influence recedes is not always the person you remembered being before the dynamic began. People change. Relationships change people. Even insufficient relationships change people, sometimes in ways that are genuinely valuable alongside the ways that are genuinely costly. The work of reclamation is not the work of recovering a previous self intact. It is the work of finding the self that exists now, in the aftermath of the dynamic, with honesty about both what the dynamic cost and what it gave, what it narrowed and what it deepened, what it took from you and what it taught you that you would not have learned without it. What the dynamic taught you about yourself is worth naming. not sentimentally, not with the performing the lesson quality of someone trying to find the silver lining that makes the cost feel worth it, simply as the honest accounting of what the experience of loving an avoidant and of finally choosing yourself over the continuation of the role actually deposited in you. It taught you what your limits actually are, not the limits you thought you had before the dynamic tested them. Those turned out to be more flexible, more absorbent, more capable of sustaining significant cost over significant time than you probably knew. The actual limits, the ones that only become visible when the testing has been thorough enough and sustained enough to reach them. You know now, in the specific and embodied way that only lived experience produces, exactly how much you can absorb before the absorbing becomes self-destruction. Exactly how long you can sustain a dynamic that is taking more than it gives before the giving stops being love and starts being the erosion of yourself. Exactly what the signals are, the specific personal, physical, emotional signals that tell you the limit has been reached and the silence is the only honest response. This knowledge is yours permanently. It cannot be unlearned. It travels with you into every subsequent relationship, every subsequent dynamic, every subsequent encounter with a person whose patterns push in the direction that this one pushed. The limit is known now. The signals are recognized. The response, the choosing of yourself, the silence that is genuine rather than performed, is practiced. It is not a response you would have to find for the first time again. It is a response you have already made from the most difficult available position and found yourself capable of sustaining. That capability is not small. It is one of the most specifically useful things a person can carry into the rest of their relational life. Not the capacity for patience. You already had that, possibly in excess. The capacity for the particular kind of self-honoring that produces the silence when the silence is what is required. The capacity to recognize the moment the dynamic has crossed from genuinely worth investing in to genuinely costing too much. And to respond to that recognition with action, rather than with the continued investment that the dynamic requires and that your previous self would have continued to provide. The avoidance, embarrassment, and fury in all of this are not your concern, not because they are unimportant. They are genuinely significant experiences that have the potential, if the avoidant allows them, to produce the honest reckoning that the fall has been pointing toward. But because their significance is in what they mean for the avoidant's own journey, for whether the avoidant takes the invitation or declines it, for whether the disruption your silence produced becomes the beginning of genuine change or gets managed back into the familiar equilibrium. That is their story. The story of the embarrassment and the fury and what they do with it. Whether it becomes the honest mirror that finally shows them something they have been declining to see, whether it produces the specific instance level, daily practice change that genuine architectural shift requires. Whether the fall lands completely or gets caught halfway down by the management strategies that have always caught difficult things before they could do their full work. Their story, their interior, their choice. Your story is already further along than theirs. Not because your journey has been easier, it has been in many specific and significant ways, considerably harder. You were the one who absorbed the dynamic's costs. You were the one who loved generously in the face of insufficient return. You were the one who finally, at significant personal cost, withdrew from the role and sustained the withdrawal through the specific discomfort of not having the reachings relief available. You did the harder thing. And the harder thing produced something that their side of the dynamic is only beginning to point toward. Something that your side has been quietly, daily, unglamorously building for the full length of the silence. The ground, solid, self-made, requiring no one else's behavior to remain stable. The ground that was always yours to find. That the dynamic was always obscuring. That the silence finally cleared enough space to reveal. Standing on it, the avoidance, embarrassment, and fury arrive as what they actually are. Not a verdict on your choices. Not evidence that your silence was wrong. Not a reason to return to the role that produced the silence in the first place. Simply the sound of a system encountering its own limits. The specific, human, unavoidable sound of a person whose model was wrong, finding out that the model was wrong. Loud and uncomfortable, and entirely completely separate from the quiet, stable, already standing reality of where you are. Where you are is not in the dynamic anymore. Where you are is in your life. Actual, moving, belonging to you life. Built from the daily choices of someone who finally understood that the most important relationship in their relational world was not the one with the avoidant, was not the one that the dynamic was organized around sustaining, was the one with themselves. That relationship, tended now, honored now, built from the genuine self-knowing that the silence produced, is the one that everything else is built on top of. Get it right, and everything built on it has a chance of being right too. The silence got it right. You got it right. And the embarrassment and the fury, receding into the background of a story that was never really theirs to control, confirm it. You were right to choose yourself. You were always right to choose yourself. The silence just finally made that choosing visible to both of you.